more damage, less speed. Simple. I've never been a fan of overly convoluted weapon stats. I like weapon concepts you can easily describe in just a sentence, and the Scotsman Skullcutter definitely fits into this category. This weapon was added to the game in May 2010, a measly 11 years ago, no big deal, oh dear god, f me, I'm old. Since then, it's remained relatively untouched, apart from a couple of tweaks here and there to fine-tune the stats. I've personally always been drawn to this weapon because of its simplicity, and while most melee weapons intended for the Demoknight are not much use without the shield or boots, I've always been curious as to whether the Skullcutter could be a valid replacement for the Demoman's bottle. So I've spent some time with this weapon to see how it performs with 3 of the main demo loadouts. Can it work as a replacement for the bottle when playing classic Demoman? Does it work with the hybrid knight? How does it compare when playing full Demoknight with his other swords? Let's try and find out. But before we jump in, let's first briefly remind ourselves of what this thing does. It has a 20% damage bonus, and it makes you move 15% slower when active. It has the usual large melee range that Demoknight weapons are granted. It doesn't specify, but we can assume it works in the same way as the Highlander, which would mean it has 50% longer melee range, and it deploys and holsters slower. Oh, and missing from this list is possibly the most important stat of all: it grants random critical hits, and it's the only Demoknight melee weapon that does this. Okay, so let's start with how Gaben intended for this weapon to be used, with the Demoknight. Firstly, I wanted to point out what the additional damage means. With a crit, it can one-shot every class except the heavy, but that's only one more class that a single critical hit from the bottle can take out. However, combine this with the shield bash from the splendid screen, and you are actually able to kill every single class in the game, even the heavy, with a single charge and crit combo, which is pretty impressive, and for some might be enough to make this weapon worth using. This also means you can do over 150 damage with the Tide Turner charge combo, allowing you to one-shot medic. And when calculating for 2 non-critical hit swings, both the bottle and the Scotsman Skullcutter are able to take out any 125 HP targets, but again the axe is able to surpass the 150 HP threshold, allowing you to take out the medic in 2 hits as well. This table compares the bottle to the Skullcutter, and typically you won't be using the bottle as a Demoknight. But that being said, even as a Demoknight with a sword, you should still be getting a fair few crits, or at least mini crits with your charge combo. And so that extra 20% damage will often just mean killing one more class than you would normally with the stock bottle or sword. But of course the random crits in between those charge combos will be bringing a ton more value. So used with a shield and boots, this becomes the super simple high damage Demoknight loadout. And this is especially the case when used alongside the splendid screen, which is the highest damage dealing shield available. When playing Demoknight, the deploy and holster penalty is of course negated, and the speed reduction could be considered somewhat cancelled out, although you will still be moving 5% slower than a normal Demoman and 15% slower than other Demoknights. But you will be charging around a lot, so maybe that's not a huge deal. I'll let you guys decide. But despite all this, I don't think the weapon gets that much use, especially when it comes to Demoknights. And the reason for this is that there are just so many better options available, like the Caber. Okay, maybe not that one. But joking aside, pretty much every other sword I would argue could provide more value than the Skullcutter. Take my 2 favourite options for example. The good old Highlander that allows you to become an absolute monster and which is so much fun to use. Just play carefully to collect a couple of heads and you are now an end boss who is able to speed around the server, demolishing everyone you come across. Or the half Zatonski, which I think is a little underrated and I personally love to use because it gives you a small injection of health often when you need it the most, right after a fight and right after getting a kill. And the other swords, which I use less often, also grant really important and valuable utility, such as allowing you to charge for longer distances or way more often. I would argue that most of these things feel more useful and give more flexibility and survivability than just the addition of extra damage that the Skullcutter provides. With this weapon there is no resetting, no snowballing, just damage, and although there is something to be said about being the ultimate damage dealing Demoknight and the fact that you can deal random crits, I just seem to have more success with other options. But I reckon you can get some value from it, especially if you have a pocket medic to keep you alive. But personally, I always end up returning to my trusty old Eilander or my favourite and admittedly somewhat unconventional Half Zechonski. That being said, the Demoknight is probably the most viable way to use this weapon, especially when considering the random crits you can get. And I think this becomes clear when you try and use it with the stock Demoman or hybrid Demoknight. The impact of this weapon's stats changes significantly when you're not playing as a Demoknight, when you're not using the boot and shield, and when you're swapping between multiple weapons. Firstly, without the speed buff that the boots and shield grant you, you start to feel real sluggish when you have this weapon active. It's extremely noticeable, and in my experience, being in the middle of a melee fight is the last place you want to be slowing down. This reduction in speed makes you the second slowest class in the game after the heavy when you're using your axe. But possibly worse than this is the deploy speed. It's a killer, often literally. The stat card thing doesn't mention the specific figure, but the wiki says it's 75% slower, so nearly twice as slow as it is to take out your bottle, and it really feels it. When you're in a pickle and you just need to whip out your axe to finish the enemy off, it can be frustrating as the Demoman draws his weapon from what feels like a tub of treacle, and unfortunately it doesn't feel like the large melee range does much to make up for this, in my experience. And when you do go back to the stock bottle, or let's be honest, the pan in my case, it just feels so good in comparison. It feels so quick and you feel as light as a feather again. However, there is the additional stat you get when using this alongside a grenade launcher or sticky bomb launcher, the guaranteed critical hit. Which is handy, in pubs at least. Because Demoman tends to do a ton of damage, his crit rate will often stay pretty high, and I think this is what attracts many people to the weapon. But when you think about it, it's really not that much of a huge upside, when considering the Demoman at least, as opposed to the Demoknight, and when comparing it to the bottle or any other weapon that deals random crits. Because a crit does a heck ton of damage, whatever melee weapon you're using. In the heat of battle, enemies will often have taken some damage anyway, and will nearly always go down with one swift crit to the face. But with the Demoknight, he has no other options that grant the random crit, so this is where that stat becomes more relevant and more of a distinguishing feature. But is it better than the other benefits that the other swords bring to the table? Plus, Demoknights who constantly land their charge crit combos probably get less benefit from the random crits because they might be getting a lot of crits anyway. So to summarise, in my experience, unfortunately it doesn't really work with the traditional Demoman or hybrid knight, as well as say stock or some of the other options. However, there is one way that this weapon becomes god tier. One way that will make the entire server fear you. One way to turn you into an absolute monster. And that is Demoflight. I don't know, pick your name. The sticky jumper person, man. This is actually how I had the most fun with this weapon. Although it's ridiculous and completely impractical, there's something about flying through the air with a huge double-bladed battle axe that feels pretty darn fun and pretty badass. Although top tip of the day, get your axe out when you're in the air, because the sudden change of speed, if you get it out while on the ground, can really mess up your jump. You're welcome. Remember guys, speed debuffs don't apply if you're literally flying. That's it, that's the video. It makes you slow, which is a bit annoying, and it's slow to get out, which is super annoying. It's fine with Demoknight, but there are probably better options. But still, super fun if you're flying around the map like a lunatic. I give this the official underpowered stamp, possibly, slightly. I'm not sure. How would you improve it? Does it need fixing? I don't know. Questions are hard. I feel like, to be honest, it's not that far being off balanced, but a tweak might do it some good. But remember, this isn't meant to necessarily be viable for the traditional Demoman, just the Demoknight, and so in that case, it might just be fine the way it is. But let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm also conscious that I didn't get a chance to talk about other weapons and how they work alongside the Skullcutter, for example the loose cannon or the lock and load. I don't see any reason why switching your grenade launcher or sticky bomb launcher would make this melee weapon more viable, but let me know in the comments below if there's a particular loadout you think it works well with, or if you're having success with this weapon. As always, thanks for watching, I love you lots, and I'll see you guys in the next video.